Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here for the second day of this conference. Today's panel is mainly in English, but also with Elodie with her presentation in Spanish. If you need translation, you know where to go to get the respective logins. And I hand right over to Birle for the introduction to the panel on the question whether we are going towards a post-global conviviality or to post-global convivialities. That's the debates that we're going to having today, and the introduction Peter Birle is going to give, and then I'll present our speakers.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here and to give you a very warm welcome to our second roundtable on towards post-global convivialities. So we are now looking a little bit more on what's happening in trans-regional, international, global relations, and how all this is connected to our general issues of conviviality, inequality. And as you know, we are living in very complex times. No? The climate catastrophe makes it clear to us that how much in this world developments are interrelated, and what is happening in one region has an impact on the whole. And on the other hand, recent years have shown that accelerated globalization is not an automatism that simply goes on forever. We have seen tendencies towards a slowdown in globalization and even de-globalization, in part consciously and voluntarily, and in part involuntarily. To give you just a few examples, less global mobility, less world trade, less free trade, less global commodity chains, more local and regional production, not least with regard to the production of essential goods, for which one does not want to be dependent on other powers in the event of a crisis. So, for example, in times of pandemic, medical masks and drugs from China. Much of this is not entirely new. While the preachers of neoliberal globalization were very successful in Latin America from the 1980s until more recently, the Asian tiger economies, for example, were already and successfully relying on more state, more regulation, more national autonomy, and more regional production chains. So the question we are asking us, our panelists, and all of us, what impact do post and deglobalization tendencies have on global conviviality? And to find answers to these questions, we asked our panelists to say something to the following questions, and therefore. First, are we in transition to a post-global phase? Are we already living in a post-global world? Are we stuck with the global as we knew it? What factors support the different points of view? And secondly, is the concept of the post-global apt to sharpen an understanding of central characteristics of contemporary coexistence or conviviality? Third, what are the vibrations between the analytical potential of encrucijadas of conviviality inequality, so what we are discussing here and all the other roundtables, and the concept of the post-global? And last but not least, to what extent are dimensions of post-global conviviality particularly evident in certain regions of the world, especially, of course, in Latin America and the Caribbean? So that is what we want to discuss with you, with our panelists here in the next 90 minutes. And Tilmann now is going to give you a brief introduction to our panelists.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to introduce all of you here. I know all of you quite well, so I'll be short nevertheless. I'll go by the order. that is on the paper that was randomly chosen. So next to me is Ajay Gandhi, an assistant professor at Leiden University College at University of Leiden in the Netherlands. He's an anthropologist and he So he's mainly specialized on urban India, and so he'll bring us into a different global or post-global dimension and perspective through that work. Our second speaker is Elodie Brun. She's joining us online. She's an associate professor at the Center for International Studies of the Colegio de Mexico, and she has worked as an international relations scholar on questions of inequalities, South-South relations, multilateralism, and Latin American foreign policies. So she brings in the political science perspective. Then I continue on the podium here. Juliana Streva is a multidisciplinary, post-disciplinary art activist scholar who holds a PhD in human rights from Freie University in Berlin, and she's published widely on very diverse issues on the questions of corporality, colonial struggles, of violence, also intersectional feminism, and peripheral insurgencies. Last but not least, I come to my colleague Gesine Müller from University of Cologne. She's part of the thinking head also behind this panel because she's recently engaging a lot in the questions of the post-global. She's a scholar of Romance studies and has published widely also on conviviality, especially sort of in line, well, in her analysis of the Caribbean literatures across the different languages and the questions of inequality and conviviality. And without further ado, I'll pass the word on to Ajay, who's going to open up, taking us a bit away maybe from just, not really actually, but yeah, sharing some thoughts with us.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in the panel. I feel like a bit of an interloper in general in this conference because I do work on Asia, and so it's been a great learning experience just to see the points of comparison. And in that spirit, I have a brief intervention that I'm going to mostly read out that tries to bring together ways to think about entanglements and care and connection through a metaphor. So as Tilmann said, I'm an anthropologist, and I think it's very useful to think with images, to think with figurations, rather than sort of abstract or invented ideas. And I was inspired in thinking about this roundtable by a recent memoir I read by the post-colonial literature scholar Hazel Carby. She has a memoir called Imperial Intimacies, which tracks her dual Jamaican and British heritage, and sort of she uses the Anansi spider as a motif in that memoir. So the Anansi spider, which some of you will be familiar with, it's a cosmological motif that's prevalent in West Africa, and through slavery it came to the Caribbean. And the Anansi is part of many different kinds of stories. It's a sort of cunning figure, a trickster figure. And Carby, in her memoir, she picks up on this idea of webbing, of the net, of the filaments between things, as a way to think about questions of migration, questions of how we narrate ourselves. And in thinking further about that, and in kind of researching that idea myself, I arrived at some interesting convergences, and which I'm going to try to relate very briefly here. So, in part, I think the Anansi is very interesting because it's a very powerful metaphor, not just for post-slavery communities in the Caribbean, but for others like indentured laborers from Asia who had come to the Caribbean from the late 19th century. And that's partly because the spider's web, I think, it gives us a kind of very vivid image of our world, one that is partially constituted, that is always fraying, that requires constant mending, that has a kind of incompletion and fragility. and yet has a kind of overall shape. And so three elements, I think, make that idea of a web rather than a root, a useful image, an idea to think with about our worlds of difference and our worlds of connection. So the first is really about the idea of a web as a spun network of connections. So how can we think about mobility across boundaries without this idea of a kind of centralized root, which is, you could say, the kind of dominant metaphor we have of community, of culture, of nation, of race. The second idea that I'm inspired by here is the idea of the web as a still unfolding and inherently unfinished project. And I think that's very important because sometimes we think of our social worlds as ideal types. They have to fulfill some kind of overall totalized shape. And that also maybe makes us a bit fatalistic or pessimistic about the quality of our decisions and choices. And so insofar as the spider's web is a image of a constant labor, I think it also really helps us to think about the undetermined quality of our worlds. And the third that I'm going to briefly relate is about the labor of maintaining the web, and how that makes central to any discussion of the global, the work of care, the fact that our support systems, like the spider's web, they rely on constant effort, on constant support. Okay, so let me just try to break down these three different elements that I think are very powerful in the Anansi spider motif and in the idea of the spider's web in general. So the first is that the Anansi arachnid was and is a powerful image for post-slavery communities insofar as I think that the abrupt severing, the kind of fracturing of relational ties through slavery, the incredible odds really against thriving meant that in places like the Caribbean, unlike the West, the fiction of primordial wholeness could not be entertained. So in line with the Roundtable's interest in thinking about geographies and timeframes, to me, what's very interesting about the Anansi is that it's a metaphor not just used by African descended communities, but through the kind of proximities induced by colonialism and by capitalism, it became enmeshed and adjacent to others. So there's very interesting work, for example, on indentured laborers who went from places like South Asia to the Caribbean, moving between Guyana and Trinidad and India from the 19th century onwards. And in these journeys, which were very dangerous by ship, these laborers told what were called Nancy tales. So these were the very same tall tales from West Africa about the spider Anansi. These Nancy tales were picked up as brown and black communities worked and lived in proximity. So not just the ship as a kind of mixed space, as a pluralistic space, but the yard, the kind of plantation yard, the Creole yard. In the 1920s, two very important American anthropologists, Melville and Francis Herskowitz, they had gone to Suriname and done a study of storytelling and narration. And in looking at the proximity of people from Java in what is now Indonesia, of the so-called Hindustanis from North India and Afro-Surinamese, they saw that part of what was also being shared were these Nancy tales. So the Anansi figure, I think, is very interesting because it moved between West Africa and the Caribbean, but then also further onto South Asia. And in that way, you can see the ways in which very literally the telling of stories is also the sort of meshing of communities. Now, to me, it's very important to think with that because I think we often still think of culture as very hermetic, as something that is like a container, something that's bounded. And to me, a web is very powerful because it's diffuse, it's leaky, it's not an exclusive property of one particular community. So the movement of the Anansi from West Africa to the Caribbean to Asia, it really reminds us actually of the importance of bodies inhabiting the same space, what Hans Gadamer calls a fusion of horizons. Carby, in her memoir, she talks about the ways in which we should think of belonging not as a resolved right, that in a sense, we are irresolved selves, that irresolution is not a problem necessarily, but it's something that maybe is an opportunity. And so I think, interestingly, like a spider's web, like a constellation of stars, like galaxies. We're talking about matter that exists in resolution, and the connections are, in a sense, yet to be made. Let me just briefly just get on to the second part of what I wanted to say here, that part of what I think is very powerful about the Anansi and spiders' webs in general is that they're in process, they are incomplete, they have a certain kind of integrity, but they don't aspire to wholeness. So if you look at a spider's web closely, parts of it are kind of usually damaged by rain, by other insects. It's weakened through pressure. The filaments which make up the netting is, in a sense, provisional. And to me, that's a very useful idea to think with, rather than wholeness or definitiveness, to think with the tentative or provisional capacity of our world. And so thinking with fibers or these filaments as flexible, as supportive, as distributed, as segmented, it again gets us out of thinking of, say, the idea that you have in some parts of the world of the territory, the land, the soil as being the place from which the people emerge. That how can we think about our world not in terms of purity or completion, but really as a kind of meshwork, as a perpetual entangled process. So with this, I'm just going to go to my final point here, that beyond thinking of connectivity through the web, and beyond thinking about distributions and what is not determined a priori, the third thing that I think is very interesting about the Anansi and the spider's web as a metaphor is the labor of care. That Hazel Carby's point in her memoir is that the spider's web, it's fragile, but it nevertheless holds. It nevertheless provides a kind of support structure. So even though webs are always fraying or damaged or broken or incomplete, they also serve nevertheless as a place to rest, to feed, to inhabit. And I think that's important because we often overlook the sometimes banal but necessary work of feeding, of mending, of upholding, of repairing, of patching. And that's what the spider does. But that's also what many kinds of people in our world do, foremost women. They serve as a kind of unseen infrastructure of nurturing, of dependency, and so on. So even though the state often marginalizes those that actually are mending the support structure, really our societies would collapse without that. So this idea of a web that needs to be constantly maintained, we have to constantly mend it. It's I think very useful to think with, because we have come to think, Peter, in his prefatory remarks, he had discussed briefly climate change, and we've, I think, gotten used to thinking of our world as irredeemable, that sort of everything is, it's broken and we can't kind of make it whole again. But I think that's a very pessimistic and maybe even fatalistic perspective, that we have to think about pain and suffering and difficulty and disintegration and as something that out of which, nevertheless, as humans, like arachnids do, they respond to that, they try to heal from that, they try to recuperate from that. Okay, so this important thing of the web as a kind of practical activity, but also as a narrative activity. When we think of mending in English, we think of it in terms of the manual activity, like mending a sweater or mending a hole in your shirt. So it's a manual activity, but it's also an emotional activity. It's an interpersonal skill. And we have to think about those practical and narrative skills, the stories we tell, and the actual practices of care we use in tandem, to me. So it seems to me that in this sense, the metaphor of the Anansi, the idea of a web of connectivity, of a mesh of mobility, it really gives us a better conceptual metaphor to think with in terms of the incompletion, the fragmentation, the in-process nature of our world. And so I wanted to just, through the web, take us on a brief journey and maybe inspire some thoughts.
So next we would have Elodie. No, not yet. Elodie, are you with us?
Yes. I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, we can't see you yet, but I'm sure we can see you in a minute. So
Okay.
perfect, now we can see you.
Okay. ¿Van a poner mi presentación? ¿O? Bueno, voy a iniciar y si puede... Ah, ya, perfecto.
Ahora sí.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Muchas gracias por la invitación y gracias particulares a Tilmann, con quien más intercambian la preparación de esta mesa. Yo veo 4 temas recurrentes en el debate político actual en el contexto de la pandemia que se refieren a lo postglobal, desde las relaciones internacionales y en particular desde América Latina y el Caribe. Primero es la escasez de varios bienes de consumo, como conductores, ropa, productos para la construcción, alimentos. Segundo es el auge de las críticas a la globalización, que cubren todo el espectro político para pedir otra globalización o menos globalización, en este último caso a favor de una vuelta a los nacionalismos. Tercero son las tensiones crecientes entre Estados Unidos y China. Y cuarto, el cambio climático que representa una amenaza a la vida humana y no humana en la Tierra. Pero para saber si estamos viviendo una transición hacia lo postglobal, parece indispensable reflexionar sobre lo que entendemos con global primero. Y aquí lo vinculo con globalización. Es la lámina siguiente, por favor. No hay contexto sí, la siguiente, por favor. No hay un consenso sobre la definición del término, obviamente. En la economía política internacional se vincula mucho el proceso de globalización con el modelo del capitalismo. Primero con la revolución industrial a finales del siglo XIX y con una segunda ola de aceleración desde los años 70. Pero esta definición no está compartida, por ejemplo, por parte de historiadores de historia global como Serge Gruzinski o Bernd Hausberger, para quienes la globalización comienza con la colonización. Y esto me parece muy importante para considerar si la globalización se vincula únicamente con un modelo económico particular o no. Y para subrayar que no es un fenómeno uniforme en el tiempo y en el espacio. En la etapa actual, creo que hay algunas características que permiten entender también el debate sobre lo postglobal. Primero, la revolución tecnológica en los transportes marítimos y aéreos y la cuarta revolución industrial. Segundo, la forma dominante del capitalismo actual, que es de tendencia neoliberal, que se vincula con apertura comercial, liberalización financiera, aunque pueda tener varias formas, como ya se ha estudiado mucho en el contexto de América Latina o con la emergencia de China. Y tercero es la intensificación de los intercambios entre seres humanos, sean estos físicos o digitales. Entonces, esta fase es más diversificada, involucra a más actores, pero como tal no es políticamente neutra y va a afectar las sociedades, generar ganadores y perdedores y por lo tanto cooperación y conflicto. Entonces la globalización puede retroceder como lo deja suponer lo postglobal. Pero lo que quiero subrayar aquí es que es muy resistente también. Sería creo que la lámina siguiente, por favor. Por ejemplo, ya hubo problemas de escasez en el momento del choque petrolero en 1973 Y también la globalización ha superado toda una serie de crisis. Si pensamos solo en el siglo XXI, el 11 de septiembre, la crisis financiera de 2008 y la actual pandemia. Esto confirma que no estamos ante un fenómeno exclusivamente económico. Si tenemos esta visión de la globalización, más que un mundo postglobal, lo que podríamos estar viviendo es un cambio en el tipo de globalización, en particular en el modelo económico dominante. Si retomamos los 4 temas que presenté al inicio, la escasez de bienes más bien confirma la importancia de la globalización para que funcione la economía desde lo global hacia lo local. Ante un desbalance coyuntural entre oferta y demanda, vemos el impacto de la dispersión geográfica de la producción a escala global y la necesidad de recuperarla para poder, de nuevo tener acceso a los bienes. Segundo, las tensiones entre Estados Unidos y China perturban el sistema para controlarlo. Lejos estamos de acciones que dejen ver el fin de la globalización por parte de estos 2 actores que se benefician mucho del sistema existente. Tercero, las propuestas de mayor control sobre los flujos de todos tipos, en sus discursos no hablan tanto de un regreso a una forma de autarquía, de encierro, sino denuncian cierto tipo de globalización. Y si vemos hacia atrás en la historia, la globalización se puede adaptar a nuevas formas, a otros modelos económicos, a mayores controles por parte de los estados, si es que los pueden implementar. Esto no significa que sea para el bien colectivo, pero creo que la globalización es un fenómeno que se puede adaptar a restricciones. Cuarto, muchos de los problemas actuales son globales. En relaciones internacionales, esto significa que la solución no está entre las manos de un solo actor, ni siquiera de los más poderosos. Y aquí creo que con la pandemia tenemos una ilustración perfecta de lo que quiero decir. Entonces, estableciendo un vínculo con lo que Ajay acabó de presentar, con la imagen de la red imperfecta, la globalización, si la consideramos como un proceso, tal vez está transitando hacia otro momento. Esteban Actis, que es un colega de la Universidad de Rosario en Argentina, él habla de la transición hacia una globalización de riesgos, que el cambio principal sería de pasar de maximizar beneficios para los actores que aprovechan la globalización capitalista neoliberal a una estrategia también de minimizar riesgos ante la globalización. Para terminar, y esto sería la otra lámina, por favor, veo 3 fenómenos que, a mi modo de ver, sí pueden revolucionar la globalización. Uno, las desigualdades. La globalización permite disminuir algunas, como el acceso al conocimiento con Internet, el desarrollo de Internet, aunque sea asimétrico aún, pero también acentúa muchas. Y sabemos hoy que si bien en la fase actual de globalización ha permitido disminuir la pobreza a nivel global, se ha acompañado este fenómeno de un aumento de las desigualdades. 2, la revolución digital, que está cambiando el vínculo social, nuestra manera de vivir la colectividad y supone repensar la sociedad en su conjunto, y esto va a impactar en la globalización. Tercero, el cambio climático, que viene a cuestionar la idea de progreso, el pensamiento científico occidental que se ha impuesto desde el siglo XIX y también nuestra relación a los recursos energéticos. Entonces, para terminar, considero que la solución a estos fenómenos menos costosa en términos humanos se encuentra en el marco de la globalización. Y en este sentido, no hay una lógica de exclusión entre globalización y convivialidad. Pensar la convivialidad en un contexto global podría comenzar por pensar en cómo atender estos desafíos que acabo de mencionar. Y para retomar una expresión pues muy clásica en RI de Alexander Wendt, que es un autor constructivista, la globalización es lo que hacemos de ella. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Elodie. The word goes on to Juliana.
Thank you, Tilmann. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for organizing this in-personal meeting since so long last year from the fellowship. So it's an immense pleasure to be here. And also I'm presenting in English since it was the language suggestion, not in Portuguese. And I was curious about the panel to be located in this post-global convivialities as a question and not in the archives or in the intersectional panels. It seemed initially more related to my research, but then I actually was very pleased to be able to have this panel as a question. So it's not a statement, it's a question if you're moving or not towards a post-global conviviality. And by answering this question, I would like actually to pose another question. And then I paraphrase Bruno Latour's to ask, have we been global yet? So instead of thinking that we are moving for a post-global conviviality, I would like to step back a bit and try to think if we're being global. And so my intervention will be 2 inquiries and then 1 brief reflection, because it's the idea of having the discussion afterwards. So I'm not going to go so deep, but we can talk later. So the first point will be about the global. As I think was mentioned by Elodie, the global has this dimension like modernity to emerge together with colonialism. So the idea of the global has been very much connected with globalization and not with just global understanding the earth, the world, the idea of where we live. So this kind of captured the total notion when we talk about the global as racial capitalism, as the moment that the world is being put in the same map with the Europe in the center, with this linear narrative, this temporality, this idea of development. So what has been called this colonial modern world system by Aníbal Quijano and Wallenstein, and it's an Eurocentric way of seeing how this global power has been operated in this kind of mode of racial capitalism, and also what we talked yesterday of sexual division of labor, feminization of poverty, food production's chain, environmental racism. But my point here is maybe reimagine the global not only by this capitalist capture of the notion of the global as globalization, but the global in a non-anthropocentric historicity that is involving the earth, the where we live together, where we coexist. So that goes beyond this way of seeing the global as a commodified, racialized domination way of relation. My second inquiry will go to the post, because I think when we have all this kind of crisis and apocalyptic moment, I think it's a shared feeling of trying to overcome and to move towards a new direction. And then we academics usually use a lot the post to think about post-modernity, post-colonialism, post-human, post-global. But why to use the post if actually we inscribe the very idea of this temporality? There is an event that we're going to overcome in this very linear way, instead of actually seeing, as also we discussed yesterday, that is not an event, is a process. Is a process and symptoms that is not actually that we're overcoming an event, but actually understand, looking back in history, as Walter Benjamin would say, to actually understand the processes that generate what we are seeing today of this collapse. So actually understanding colonial legacy that creates today, and not claiming to go to a post, but actually to look back to disentangle and dismantle the structure that's producing the collapse of today. As I think we talked yesterday about this clash of event and process, and also have been a lot of scholars problematizing this notion of moving beyond without dealing with the past. Then my my moment of trying to think it, if we haven't been global yet, instead of just claiming to move for a post-global conviviality, will be to try to reread history of this ongoing violence and institutional and structural racial capitalism, to see that maybe there is another way of seeing global, not in this frame that I've been presented so far of racial capitalism, but actually as a relational, as a relation, as a poetic relation, as Edouard Glissant would say. And I think goes very in direction what Ajay just presented as a web, as a rede, an encruzilhada, as is in the title of the encounter, the annual encounter of Mecila, as a way that actually is a coalition, that we live together, that we live in the same, that we are interconnected, mutually dependent in the globe. And this actually is to reaffirm a very, not a novelty at all, but a Ubuntu philosophy that I am because we are. So to see the other not as, and now creating a web of dialogues here. I think when Susanna was speaking yesterday about security, and I think I was thinking a lot how the political thinking since this 17th century has been thinking about nation formation and borders in this notion of security from. So we secure a country from the other, is all this time of dehumanization, of protection against the other, this antagonistic way to affirm the one, you need to deny the other. And what there is a movement with the eco-politics is to think security with, which became quite emphasized during the pandemics, is to understand that we are only secure if the other is also secure. So my security depends on your security. And this is actually reaffirming Ubuntu's philosophy that I am because we are, is to move the security from for security with will be another way to actually frame the global, that we are interconnected, and to think maybe, as Sergio mentioned in the introduction, this planetary dimension of the global and not only the racial capitalist dimension of the global. So moving from the security from to security with is also rethinking the critique of capitalism, not to reinscribe a green capitalism or ecofascism, but actually to dismantle this colonial, racist, sexist, LGBT-phobic structure or the organized society. And I would just close my provocation, my intervention with the manifesto that was just published by the Black Coalition for Rights in Brazil on this Friday, since they are attending the COP26 in Glasgow. And they published the manifesto that is called, I will read in Portuguese the title, Para controle do aquecimento do planeta, desmatamento zero. Titular As terras quilombolas é desmatamento zero. In this manifesto, that's for controlling the global warming of the planet, zero deforestation. And they claim that actually the entitled of quilombolas in traditional lands is a way to go to the zero deforestation. This manifesto connects directly the crucial imperative today to think about racial, environmental racism as something connected to the ecocide with the feminization of poverty, that is not possible to just talk about environmental collapse without dealing with all those entanglements, well, those webs, this rhizomatic image that Ajay so well described here, that one thing depends on the other in the very fragmented, unfinished, open and complex way. So I would think that this, instead of going for a post-global, maybe we should just try to reinvent the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. The word is on to Gesine. Thank you.
So thank you very much for everybody who made this conference possible. Thank you very much for everybody who came here to us to Cologne. It's a great pleasure for me to be in this roundtable. How well suited is the notion of post-globality for focusing on central characteristics of today's conviviality? I would like to examine or re-examine this question from the viewpoint of literary and cultural studies. Recently, phenomena such as the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the global surge of political populism have repeatedly demonstrated that after 30 years of shaping the world, the most recent phase of accelerated globalization is over. New categories and concepts are needed in order to respond to this exhaustion of the global project while devising alternative models and ideas of globality. Particularly with regard to research questions in literary and cultural studies, the post-global banner lends itself well to investigating these highly topical modes of reflection. Post-globality denotes a critical response framework that helps us understand the problematic economic, ecological, political, social, and technological dimensions of this current phase of globalization by seeking out new forms of world creation. As a complex category within cultural studies and aesthetics, the term post-global comprises a critical observation of contemporary life worlds and the development of new global imaginaries of future life worlds. As such, in my view, it decisively transcends the concept of deglobalization, which has usually been discussed in connection with economics and development policy, a concept fixated on world trade and economic policy dimensions. Since the 2008 financial crisis and the resulting political and economic processes and strategies of disembedded unilateralism, this second concept has seen a paradoxical boom. And so when I refer to the advent of a post-global epoch, partly in light of concepts of conviviality and adjacent academic fields, I'm not claiming that worldwide phenomena of not networking and integration have been discounted or discarded. Rather, this concept is a discursively and epistemologically novel and critical response to the production, consequences, and asymmetries of globality itself. Especially considering such asymmetries, Latin American literatures present uniquely apt subjects for analysis. After all, a great many works of 21st century Latin American literature, especially since 2008, have navigated and portrayed the complex and at times paradoxical effects of the globalized experience of the world. Since the phase of 2010, distinct aesthetics have emerged in Latin American literatures and cultures, aesthetics that scarcely address the same experience of world exhaustion outlined earlier. It is noteworthy that within the ever-globalizing international publishing industry, since the 1960s, Latin American literatures especially, with their powerful centers of valuation located in the West to this day, have played a pioneering role in regard to the circulation and reception of literatures from supposed peripheries or the global South. On a narrative level, this special status has gone hand in hand with specific literary forms and modes of storytelling, partly forged in Europe, partly and decidedly emerging from the shared experience of post-colonial structures, although these writings have frequently enacted and interrogated dynamics of center and periphery formation. Given this background, it should be no surprise that Latin America has been home to an unusually complex and multifaceted literary contemplation of globalization experiences, including explorations of the most recent trends towards a post or deglobalization. Think, for example, of the work of writers such as Samantha Schweblin, Yuri Herrera, and Benjamin Labatut. The potential of an ambivalent dimension of world exhaustion or creation is especially useful for gaining insight into contemporary forms of coexistence during the present post-global phase. Literary works and cultural products not only stage new phenomena of exhaustion, but also delve into processes of new creation in the course of the encrucijadas of conviviality inequality that we are focusing on today in our conference. Thus, literary fictions hold an imaginative potential in regard to future convivialities, whether successful or not. They paint fictional images of the present and the time to come, images that configure the field of possible futures. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our 4 panelists. The idea now is that we are going to start with some questions we would like to ask our panelists, and then we like to open the floor for your questions. And I would have one question for each of you, starting with Ajay. So first of all, thanks a lot for introducing the Anansi spider's web idea. It made me think in one of my famous books, I already told you, by Neil Gaiman, no? American Gods, and I like the book much more than the Netflix movie show because it leaves some space for imagination. And also another famous book when you were talking of mending, no? So important. But you know that capitalism tells us that spending is better than mending, no? Since Brave New World. No, but what I wanted to ask you, and I really enjoyed the different perspectives you forgave us on the same issue. So I really like this idea of the spider's web. What I was asking myself is, who is the spider and who are the flies? And if we try to use it as really as an idea for global reds, for a global web, so perhaps there are more than one spider, and perhaps there are more than. I was really asking myself, is there one web? Is there one global web? Or are there webs of webs? No? So I would like to make you think a little bit in this direction. And for Elodie, Elodie, thanks a lot for your questions. These were also the question I, as a scholar of international relations, was asking myself when I read the questions well, I told you before, which were Gesine's questions. And one thing you mentioned was the idea of less globalization that could perhaps mean more nationalism, of course, but it could also mean more regionalism, for example. So what do you think about this? And for Juliana, I really liked your question, have we been global yet? And I would like to ask you, what would it mean to be global yet? So because very often I'm asking myself, are we really living in one world? Of course, climate catastrophe and migration tells us that, yes, we are living in one world now, but very often experiences are quite different. Globalization experiences are quite different. And so I think there are different worlds of experiences. We are living here in an island of prosperity. And so we are very lucky with respect to a lot of things, no? And so this is a kind of globalization experience quite different to globalization experiences in many other parts of the world. Now the pandemic and the climate catastrophe and perhaps also the consequence of migration makes us notice, oh, okay, there may be other consequences, but so I have my doubts whether really on all the different levels we are experiencing the same thing. And for Gesine, when you were talking of Latin American literature, I really would like to ask you, could you give us some examples of these literary reflections on post-deglobalization tendencies in in current Latin American literature, because I'm not a literature scholar, and I think not all here are so familiar with the authors you mentioned. And so I really would like to ask you if you could give us some examples of this. And perhaps another question, you are talking of the advent of a post-global epoch. I was asking myself, what personally do you understand by this post-global epoch? Thank you.
I'll just basically gonna ask one question to all of you to again also have some time for the audience. I find it really fascinating how all of your contributions brought together other ways of seeing sort of this situation we're in on this planet. So you focus on processes, practices such as mending, the ecology, aesthetics, relations, poetics, ethics, care, meshworks, encrucijadas, etc. So I find it super fascinating because there seems to be a switch away from like capitalism, or even sometimes it feels, and that's my question basically, a switch away from politics. So there's very much a focus onto this meso level of abstraction, this meso level of where things are happening, where the meshwork is, it's horizontal, it's interlinked, it's relational, it's practices, it's process. It's not this linear sort of story that we have been sort of taught about our lives. So I'm curious whether you could say something about where the politics come back in here, or what the politics are, how politics change. Obviously, I know that this is not apolitical, what you've been saying, but I'm just curious how it fits together with this globalized world, this capitalist world, this unequal world in which we're embedded. And that brings me basically then in a second flip of the question, whether you could say something about, or be more clear or more specific about the epistemological stance that you're taking. Because I feel, especially when I listen to, for example, just to give one example, to Gesine, when she says, there's these literatures that could be pointing towards a post-global, there's these that have been forged at the encounter of sort of the colonializing Europeans and the world. I'm just curious whether this temporality whether it's just a temporality if we use now with Juliana these process notions, whether it's a temporality that only really fits still again within a European narrative, whether from a different point of view, be it from the Anansi's web, for example, or be it from the globalist what we make of it, what Elodie said, whether it's not just turning this whole logic of the post and the global and all of that upside down. So whether we are actually, from our epistemological stance, given in the disciplines that all I situated most of you within and you situated yourselves within, whether it isn't actually a handicap to this enterprise of changing and trying to understand what we're going through. Thank you. I'd suggest we have a brief round of just reflections of you on your your mutual talks, and so you have a chance to say something, and then we open for this debate in the audience also, so you can already think of your questions. We have now still like half an hour to do that. Thank you. Anyone of you wants to go first, or otherwise I would. Exactly. Ajay.
Thank you, Tilmann, and also Peter, for your comments. I won't say too much about metaphorically. One could think with the web in all kinds of directions, and clearly there's, I think, no depending on the perspective one adopts, that meshwork is very intimate, contained, bounded within our own relations, and it's much more diffuse. And so I think it's more a matter of scale, that question. What I do think is interesting about what you said is that you know, in a spider's web, you're having all kinds of activities happening, including predatory activities, right? And so predation and care is happening simultaneously, and there's no distinction in a sense between the sort of world constitution, if you want to use that term, in terms of what is a form of nurturance, and what is a form of murder, if in a sense, right? That so, what does one do with that? Well, I think the spider's web isn't an innocent metaphor, but I think it's helpful to think of those things as being happening at the same time and happening not. We can't parse or distinguish necessarily those activities always, and I think that's also sometimes I feel like in the discussions of climate change, that part is not really put on the table. We have a maybe innocent idea of how we can, like zero, and everything will sort of be fine. But the earth and our own selves, our own bodies, our own societies have also been built on forms of predation, and to think that that's going to vanish through some kind of alchemy of climate science, I think is not correct. So that, I mean, if I had more time, I would have actually liked to have gone into that, because I think care is always happening alongside violence, and the spider's web, I think, contains all of that at once. And the one last thing I'll say about this is that in terms of the movement of spiders, I think it's a very useful metaphor, because spiders are always moving not in a kind of linear or sequential manner, right? That we in modernity, we have this sort of idea that, as you had said, that we move from one thing to the other, and it's all very neat and tidy. But the way a spider moves as it's trying to take care of things on the web is athwart. It's moving like a crab, right? And that's, I think, very useful to think with, that we don't have to get preoccupied with, as you had said, having a triumphant post narrative, but we are moving a little bit like crabs in uncertain directions. So there's something about the directionality of the spider and the web that I think is very useful also to think with in terms of our society.
And even the threads are very different, no? There are some threads that let you walk and others that make you die.
Elodie?
Okay, thank you, Tilmann. So we agreed I will try to answer in English, but if you understand me better with the translator, just let me know and I switch back to Spanish. So thank you, Peter, for your question. I think it depends on what you mean with regionalism. If you understand it like supranationality, the European Union process, I think, of course, it is the kind of regionalism that will receive a lot of criticism in Latin America right now. But maybe we can think also about CILAC, PROSUR, or Pacific Alliance, and it would be a confirmation of a light regional cooperation among governments. So, well, maybe less globalization could perhaps mean a change in regionalism, but you know that in Latin America, it depends on governments and context a lot, but I'm not sure it would be an automatic logic between both phenomena. Regarding Tilmann questions, away from politics, I don't think so. I think politics, the less you see politics, the more you have it here in social phenomena. I remember when I was a student and we were studying neoliberalism and everything, when our teachers saying, well, the official discourse is that neoliberalism tries to avoid politics. And now the official discourse is that neoliberalism is pure politics also. So I think even in practices, we have politics, and you have a series of studies in international relations right now that are highlighting this, that even in informal practices, you have political logic. So I don't think it's a problem. That's the way we try to resolve our challenges. And regarding the European trend and if it is a limitation, well, I think it is really necessary to broaden our scopes nowadays and to try to understand other ways of thinking. But I also think that the European thinking is diverse. And we are able to develop critical ideas among us, I think, and among with the European traditions also. The dream would be to have the development of European ideas along with other visions. And that's true that we are still not there. Living in Latin America, I can feel the domination of some Western ideas on over local ideas. And I always fight with my colleagues in Mexico just to try to give more visibility to Latin American production. And that's really not easy because of a lot of elements, like the way we are evaluated in Mexico, for instance. But that's another topic, I think. So thank you.
Yes, thank you also for the questions. And I would start with the Peter question about what do I mean by we're not being global yet. And I think that I agree that we have different world experiences, but I don't think that the global necessarily denies the local. I think different from modernity, there is this kind of opposition way of understanding modernity, like that you're moving the ancient time to a modernization period. I think the global actually is the entanglement of the local with the global. So it's all the time trying to see the material experience in one place to understand complex relations. They're not reduced to the local. So I think they're more a way of not reducing, not denying the local, but at the same time seeing other possibilities and other types of relations to think the global. They are not only of domination. So it's not only about the colonial relation of that, what I call racial capitalism, how to think the global in another frame that involves also environmental issues and all this interrelationality that it's necessarily in the earth, that we are connected, that we live in the same earth. And I think this type of debate became quite prominent in the environmental or eco-political debate, but this is also a debate to talk about racism, sexism. It's not possible to disconnect this when we talk about this interdependence. And I think this also came more to the forefront with Corona pandemic, because then was also this idea of thinking about security, not against, but a security with. So I think this was my idea, to see that maybe we're not being global yet, because we haven't been understanding that this interrelationality is not only, should not be reduced to this racial capitalism experience of the global or neoliberal experience of the globalization, but other ways of understanding this interconnection. And then I think with this image of the web or the image of the rede, I think it's also an interesting way of trying to understand these interdependencies. And Tilmann, when you went and said, when the politics come back, it's like, when the politics left? Like when we're talking about the racism and anti-colonial or aesthetics, I think the political are there, but even the poetics, but I understand the importance of making this epistemological stance that maybe, as when I was trying to rethink the global, I was engaging with this anti-colonial, feminist, queer epistemologies to try to not just reinscribe what global has been meant so far, but actually to try to reimagine other ways of perceiving global and coexistence in this earth. So it will be more like a provocative way of thinking this concept in another way that maybe is not the most common understanding. Thank you.
So thank you for these very important questions. To give some examples of Latin American literary reflections of the post-global or the subject of exhaustion, literature is always very rich, so you don't have this analytical answer. And you will also find examples of literary texts in the 1990s, for example, which are dealing with this subject. But now you have a tendency where you can observe very dense production of the subject of exhaustion. For example, Yuri Herrera in Mexico has published in 2011 a novel which was dealing with the pandemic situation, another pandemic situation. Benjamin Halabatut in Chile, Patricio Brun, for example, with Mañana tendremos otros nombres, is dealing with the digital situation to get friendships and partnerships, for example. So you have a very rich production of this subject, which you will also find in other literatures of the world. But as we are talking here, our point of departure is Latin America and Caribbean. I'm just mentioning these authors. The question of Tilmann, talking about the beginning of a post-global epoch. I'm very conscious about the provocation character of what I'm saying, and I think it's important to use sometimes provocation. And what I think it's very important is to make a distinction between a descriptive and a programmatic level of when we are talking about globalization. We are also having the risk to not define clear the descriptive and the programmatic level. And if you're talking about the programmatic level of globalization, I think it's very useful to use the term post-globalization, because we are living a rupture in the recent phase of globalization. I would always follow the concept of different phases of globalization since the 15th century. And in this last phase of accelerated globalization, there's a rupture which is including the negative sides of globalization in a density we never had before. We also had positive and negative sides of globalization, but the rupture we are living today is that big that I think it's important to find new ways of epistemological approaches to describe the global project. And so I'm using the post as a provocation, yes.
Thank you to all of you. Let's go to the audience. Is there questions? There's Gloria.
The shorter you ask your questions, the more time our panelists have to give you answers. Start with Gloria.
So we have
2, 3.
Gloria, then there's Sergio, Eve. It's a bit of a challenge to recognize you only by your eyes. Gloria.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentations. It's a lot to think about global and post-global. I like very much the quotation Elodie did. Globalization is whatever we want to do with it or with her, if we like a feminine personification of the concept. I think it's good to think globalization as a woman. No, okay. I have a question. What about the local? What about the local from the global perspective? Is it possible to come back to local culture representations, to local politics, to local forms of socialization, or it isn't? Is it possible? I think during the pandemic times, it was a lot of local approaches in cultural representations, in literature, in politics, national revival of nationalisms. Is it possible, or it isn't in global times?
Yeah, thank you so much for this really fascinating discussion. And I'm quite surprised how our presentations fit into another. It's really impressive. I have a brief comment, and if you like, the panelists they can, of course, react to them. But a question to Gesine. My comment is related to this attempt to put some sort of boundaries, saying we are finishing our epoch and entering in another epoch and so on. And my ideas is not perhaps to be better to go back to the the point also made by Elodie, to come back to the old constructivist idea. So we have different narrations, interpretations, disputing the sort of kind of form of presenting what we are experiencing, what observing in that own way. So at least I see that three different tendencies. The first one is a sort of back to business as usual, but with some idea of sustainability, so we can extract more resources from the planet if you are more sustainable. And then you have idea of care, of we need to change our way to deal with the planet. So the sort of planetary thinking in which the idea not of expansion, of exploitation, but of care, self-care, interdependence is in the center. Then you have, of course, also nationalist, what Peter and also Elodie mentioned as deglobalization. But I think in this nationalist variation, you have also exploitation, exploration of the resources in the same way as you had before. So in that way, so very short the question to Gesine. Gesine, you focus very much on literature. And my question would be, this sort of word creation is also quite present in music, in art, in the cinema. And the impression I have is that these other forms of art are faster in creating alternative ways of defining the situation we are living. So the question would be how to focus only on literature.
We take Eve, and then is there any
Thank
questions online?
Yeah, we are all uneasy with this question of post-global, I think. And it is a question for all of us also, I think. And my question will be to get in the direction of Juliana. First, is the post-global getting back to the local? This question raises a question of the binary thinking about local, global, glocal, and there is nothing binary, is our experience of, and maybe the thing is, how do we think at a multiple scale of the experience? Because, and there is a getting back to the local, and taking also Bruno Latour, he is emphasizing very much the territory now, because the stake is an ecological stake, so a stake of how do we live here and now in the place. And this phenomenon of getting back to the territory is a global phenomenon. But what I would like to stress is that, and the pandemics did insist on that, is that there are other scale, they are very, very important, they are the domestic scale. We were obliged to get back to the domestic life during the pandemic, and also the personal, so the personal scale. Experiencing the global is a personal experience for everybody also, and not only for the multinational enterprise, for the states and so on. So the stake for us is to try to think the variability of the scales and the combination of the scales. And so maybe I could ask for everybody, how do you deal with this multiplicity of scale?
Thank you, Yves. Okay, we take the last question, Susanna, then also Jeff, and then the question online. And if you short, so then we also have a bit of time to answer. Thank you.
I will be short. This is for Juliana, but you can also respond. If we change from post to reinvent, reform, refund, are philosophies and sociologies of the future possible or even necessary? Do we have to do sociologies of the future, philosophies for the future, let's say? So this is a kind of epistemological imaginary question.
Thank you, Susanna. Jeff in the back. Jeff in the very back. Müller.
Thank you all for a great panel. One of the challenges of being a living researcher is that we live in the present. And as you were all talking, I kept thinking to myself, wow, if we had had leaders of the Nahuas before the Spanish arrived sitting up there, they would be saying very similar things. The world is changing. We're in a new phase. Everything is challenging. And so I'm wondering how each of you as scholars are thinking about your own self-reflection in the present as you're considering globalization and perhaps trying to hold for the presentist emotion in reflecting both on the past and on the future.
Thank you, Jeff. Felix, could you read out?
It's a question for Ajay Gandhi from an anonymous user. The idea of the net is basically Han's idea of hyperculturality. Do you agree with Han in regard to the role of humans as travelers within this web and the consequent change of space in this conception? That would be a fundamental change when thinking cultures and globality.
Great. So I would suggest all of the panelists get a couple of minutes to do a few reflections on all these many interesting thoughts. Ajay, are you ready?
I'm not familiar, just to this last question, I'm not familiar with the work that was mentioned, and so I'll be curious to read it. Yeah, I do think that the net has some usefulness for us to think about, as I was saying earlier to Peter, to sort of the non-linear movements we have and the forms of surprising connection, right? The fact that the Anansi can move, though it seems to be, in terms of my own classical anthropological training, a very bounded, very historically specific, very culturally loaded idea. The fact that it could move fairly seamlessly to the Caribbean and then to other communities and then around the world is kind of a demonstration of that, the power of that that webbing. But I'll have to read the work to be able to answer it further. Maybe I'll just say something briefly to Jeff's interesting question, because I don't think I can say anything else. What does it mean, if I understood you correctly, you're asking us, how do we reflect on our present predicament as living in the present about the past and the future? Yes. Yeah, for me, it's very interesting to work with something like the Anansi or with metaphors, because they have a certain malleability, they have a certain flexibility that entangles us to the past and to the future. To me, concepts, insofar as they're abstract and invented, which is many of us are in that business of generating new keywords, that to me has a limited shelf life. There's something very enduring about images, about allegories. There's a certain plasticity to them that I think is very useful. So for me, it resonates, the Anansi, the spider's web, as as a human being, as a son, as a father, as a friend, as someone that's interested in my own netting in the world. But it, to me, is also very powerful because it's provided so much inspiration to others, that it provides a way to think through their own lives. And that, I think, is, for me, much more interesting than trying to generate a keyword that may or may not capture the experience, including keywords around the post. Yeah, because I agree with you. Yeah, 500 years ago, people would have been in general reflecting on the uncertainties, the evolution, the disruptions. Yeah, that seems to be a constant, right? So it's maybe more useful to work with those enduring images or metaphors, at least for me. So that.
Elodie, do you want to go next?
Okay, thank you. To answer Gloria's question about the local, I also think that there are no exclusionary logics between the global and the local, and that the global can influence the local and the local can influence the global. In the end, when you think, and that's even more pertinent when you think about climate change challenges and how we can develop more local ways of sustainable living. But I think it is very difficult to implement when we think about big global cities, now, such as Mexico City, where I am living. It is very hard to think about like an autonomous local way of life and sustainable. Regarding Sergio's comment, I totally agree, but I would say it's very difficult to live like this when we have been educated to think about reality and truth. And so how can we take political decisions as citizens if we think only in terms of narratives? That's a challenge I have for myself. And to finish with Jeff's comment, in my case, and that's really linked with my personal experience in Mexico, I think in terms of inequalities, and I think that's why I am here at Mecila. That's really important, from the local to the global. What I observe all the time since I live in Mexico, it's how inequalities are really part of our system. You can think about international relations, that's what I am working on, without thinking about inequalities to understand how it works. And I don't know if I have answered, but that's the way I think in everyday life.
Thank you, Elodie. Juliana?
I would actually combine the questions because I think they are quite in a dialogue. So Gloria and Eve, about this relation of local and global, I totally agree with you, because I don't see this as an opposition, as a binary, as different from modernity, as I mentioned, that is kind of refusing the ancient to move to this modern way. I think the global is not refusing or denying the local, but it's a relation. So actually the local is the way of understanding problems and to see global structures. It's not possible to understand global structures that are not from the local. And I think the local also has the space to materialize and problematize and see roots of fugitivity, roots of transformation, of how those structures could be different. And this is not only like abstract thinking, it's not only like this theory that is disembodied from the practice, but is actually directly entangled to the concrete, material, ongoing practice of social movements to understand theoretical production. So I think it's kind of a philosophical praxis that is directly connected the local experience to think, frame, or reimagine, as Susanna put this kind of, not the post, but the to reimagine or rethink or relearn or reframe this kind of imaginary. And I think then going with, I think Jeffries, when you ask about our own practice, I think it's to think about political philosophy or political terms, not as an abstract concept that is floating in an academic bubble, but actually something that emerges, or should at least emerge, from social movements and practice, to actually have this theory that is practice, that it's a theory that is entangled and connected with the practice, and the practice that is retroalimented, that foster the theory. Otherwise, I really don't see much of the point of just having creating concepts by the purpose of creating a concept. And then go in direction of Susanna, that kind of put this imaginary epistemological of re and the post. I think it's also to move from this against to the with. And then goes to what you were talking about, the security yesterday, that's all this narrative of to be protected from the other, but actually to understand that we live with the other, and then we need to be secure with, and then it's a way of dismantle the necropolitic, biopolitic thing that is still reinscribe the zone of being and zone of non-being, to understand that we are all kind of sharing the zone, and the zone should be for, so it's tried at least to not be just in the utopian dimension, but to dismantle the system of oppression and understand relationality. Yeah, thank you for the questions. They're very, very thought-provoking.
Thank you, Juliana. Gesine, sorry.
Thank you for all these very important questions. The others answered a lot, so I'm trying to give an answer to what Sergio was asking me. The field of literature, it's very important to see the cultural production as a whole and to work of other disciplines, not only of literature. So I think the dialogue between different arts and cultures is very, very important. And I'm just in the beginning phase of a project, so I'm very happy to have an overview of the field of literature, with what I don't have at all, because every week thousands of novels are produced. We will never be able to read everything which is on the market. So, but I think you're right. Other fields of cultural production are often faster than the field of literature. So literature can learn a lot of the field of music or other kinds of arts, and I'm very open to this. And another thing is how can survive literature in this presence. I think we have lots of indicators that literature, yes, will survive, but it's every day a hard work. So thank you very much.
Famous last words? Okay, no, just I would like to thank all four panelists. I would like to thank you. I think we had a good start today. And just a last word regarding your question, what about the local? It made me think also that all these ideas we have been discussing in the last decade or more on provincializing Europe and also Anglo-Saxon ideas has a lot to do with the importance of the local, with diversity, and so I think the local has never been lost. It's very important to make it stronger. No? So the whole decolonial discussion is about exactly about the importance of diversity of the local, in line with what Juliana has been saying. Thanks a lot to all of you. I think we have a coffee break now, and then we continue.
Thank you also from my side. Maybe just thank you to all of you. And now to you. The next time slot will start in half an hour, which is 2 panels in parallel. So the panel on spatial struggles of conviviality will be in this room, and a panel on multinormative and legal pluralist affinities to conviviality inequality will be in the Robert Elscheid room, which is on the ground floor, sort of this way. It's this beautiful room with the red chairs and a huge table. So choose wherever you want to go.